Good evening, good day, and good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to today's Fritz Stern lecture, The Travails of Theorizing about the Integration of Europe, Neo-Functionalism and its Competitors by Philippe Schmitter. Tonight's program was made possible by generous donations from the late Henry Arnold, as well as the Verlag CH Beck, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Beck in the virtual audience tonight and today. I'm also delighted to welcome several friends, admirers, followers, and groupies of Philippe here. Among them, Karen Alter, Gerhard Kasper, Dieter Grimm, Andrew Moravcik, Fritz Schaub, Michael Zürn, and Werner Weidenfeld. Philippe's lecture will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by Christoph Möllers, who I have the pleasure to introduce now, although he hardly doesn't need an introduction at all, because anybody who thinks about European law, constitutional law, public law, and the theory of normativity has encountered Christoph and his writings. He holds the chair of public law and legal philosophy at the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and is a permanent fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. If we look at the list of universities where Christoph has taught and researched, we might suspect that he is the perfect example of what we call a Weltbürger. He has held previous positions as a professor of public law, as you all know, at the universities of Münster and Göttingen. He was also at the NYU, at the CEU in Budapest, at Princeton, and in Paris. He's a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, and between 2011 and 2014 was a judge at the High Administrative Court Berlin-Brandenburg. His recent publications include Freiheitsgrade, Elemente einer liberalen politischen Mechanik, published with Surkamp in 2020, as well as Demokratiesicherung in der Europäischen Union, which he wrote together with Linda Schneider and which was published in 2018.
Volker, she did one with Volker.
You can later talk about that as well. You're most welcome. But for tonight, equally relevant is his essay Krisenzurechnung und Legitimationsproblematik in der Europäischen Union, published in 2015, where Christoph talks about crises of the European Union, and he actually argues that they cannot simply be attributed to EU institutions, but actually are results of incoherent policy preferences. So this past Monday at the American Academy, we had an artist talk with Sean Scully. And Sean Scully did not only talk about his art, he also talked about his various visits to Germany and how he encountered all these grumpy professors who were super, super boring. If anything, the existence of Christoph Möllers proves that Sean Scully was wrong. He is among one of the most liveliest, friendliest, and funniest professors in the area. And so it's my great pleasure to show you, dear audience, the virtual existence of the real Christoph Möllers. Christoph, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this most lovely introduction, which makes me a bit humble and gives me a pause to introduce now to you, Philippe Schmitter, who again doesn't need any introduction because, as we see from the guest list, many people of you know much more about Philippe than I do and about his theory, have co-editors, co-authors, surely many readers and many critics also of Philippe's work in our virtual audience. So good evening from my side, from Berlin too. Let me just shuffle you very shortly through Philippe's academic life, especially for those of you who are not as introduced into his work as many of the audience is. Philippe pursued his studies in Dartmouth, in Mexico City, and in Geneva, so in a way in 2.5 different continents, before then ending up at the University of California at Berkeley, where he got his PhD. Ernst Haas was on the committee, and this was probably a fateful encounter for his further work. He then taught at the University of Chicago, at the European University Institute, at Stanford, and then again at the European University Institute. So he came in a way back and forth between the United States and Europe. And I must say, as a constitutional and European lawyer, I always thought that the most interesting stuff you can find in law as much as in political science about European integration comes from people with an American experience. He got many prizes, awards, honorary degrees, which I don't really want to name here. Much more interesting seems to me to say a little bit about the breadth, the length, and the style of his work. First of all, the sheer time of his presence in the debates on comparative political sciences is just amazing. We look at his CV and we see that the first relevant, perhaps, might correct me, publication together with Ernst Haas is coming from 1964, a paper that he later called a successful failure. And he intervened in the discussion about integration and neo-functionalism we will talk about today in the late 60s, so that he is around as a relevant voice in the theory of European integration and other topics now for more than 50 years. When we try to look at his most enduring contributions to the comparative field of comparative political sciences, there are always two named, and I have to do that too. One is obviously the introduction of corporatism into the theory of political sciences. Again, corporatism that was back then in a way an outdated concept, somehow affiliated to political romanticism, only used in a normative, mostly critical manner. And he somehow dig that out to use it as an analytic concept, juxtaposed to American theories of pluralism and helpful to give a conceptual framework to comparative political sciences. The second major contribution is obviously his contribution to neo-functionalism. I don't want to say too much about this because this is part of the very topic today, the refinement of the question, how can we explain regional integration, not only, but also within Europe. When you read, and I reread some of Philippe's pieces for this little introduction, when you read his pieces, there are many things you somehow notice that are, for me at least, somewhat unusual or particular. First of all, there's this amazing conceptual rigor. Philippe's work loves conceptual distinctions, has in a way, amazing belief in the subtlety of concepts, something that may be not as usual today in political science, and much of political science, than it should be. Maybe I'm a lawyer and maybe I can somehow identify with this in a particular manner. Then there's the reflexivity of his theory. He seems, while he does theory, and we would see that today too, while he is doing theories, reflecting upon the limits of theory, about the need to correct theory, he's in a way a self-observing theorist that who always tries to control and to correct his own concepts with regard to the reality they try to describe. There are many examples for that. Let's only name one: the perhaps unforeseen relevance of the European Council as an organ in European integration that somehow had to be included into the model, but was not foreseen in one of its earlier versions. Then there is an amazing sense in a way for topics. When we discuss today about democracy, we talk about authoritarianism, we have been talking about transition, we talk about illiberal, pre-liberal, post-liberal democracies. Philippe has been talking about that for quite a while. We know with regard to his interest in Latin American politics, that he has talked about transition way before 1989, when transitional theory somehow became much more in fashion. He has talked about post-liberalism and pre-liberalism in the 1990s, when everyone was in a way a liberal optimist. He has been talking about disintegration as a necessary element of integration theories early in the 2000s, maybe earlier. That's the earliest thing I could find. So as a German lawyer, one also almost becomes an Hegelian in a way conceptual effort that has this kind of prophetic effect, in that many of the topics he has been discussing now for decades now come into fashion again. Having said that, we will get something of this reflective approach to theory today when he talks about the Travails of theorizing about the integration of Europe, about neo-functionalism, about the development of neo-functionalism, and about the competitors of neo-functionalism, which still is, to my mind at least, the most subtle, most interesting, and most demanding attempt to theorize European integration. Thank you for that. The scene is now yours. The screen is now yours, pardon me. And before you start, let me endorse and that everyone in the audience should type questions into the talk, so that we have a lively discussion when Philippe is done with his talk. Thank you very much. Philip?
Thank you, Christoph. Am I on? I guess so. No, not yet. Am I speaking?
You're on, yeah.
Oh, you can hear me, okay. Well, thank you for a very generous introduction. It is a pleasure to do this, even if I'm not very familiar with this sort of, these systems. Theorizing about the European Union is and has been and remains a very hazardous business. My talk will be divided into two parts. First, I'll talk in general about the problems that one faces in theorizing about the European Union, and then I will refer specifically to that particular aspect of the adventure, namely neo-functionalism, that I have been involved in. Now, I'll start with an anecdote, and I can't remember who said this. I think it was it? Anyway, Don Puchala. Anyway, someone who was not himself a theorist of European integration described the theorist of integration as a group of masked, blindfolded scholars who were asked to fondle the same element or different parts of the same elephant. And needless to say, each one of them produced a different description of the elephant and of its capabilities and likely future. I have been involved in that masked endeavor at a somewhat once removed, in the sense that the person who was really involved in it and who taught me was Ernst Haas, but nevertheless, all of the students of European integration were masked in a sense. What that doesn't also tell you is there's only one elephant. Normally in the social sciences, we theorize about things which occur in many different places and in many different points in time. So with the multiplicity of observations, it's possible to develop a more convincing theories. In this case, we're all fondling only one elephant. There are other regional supranational organizations. In a recent book by Tobias Lenz, for example, is based on a database of some 36 regional organizations, which are, at least on paper, regarded as comparable to the European Union. There's hardly a country in the world which is not a member of at least one, and some are members of several regional organizations. Someone said that Israel may be the only country in the world that doesn't belong to some regional organization. But none of them are really equivalent to the European Union. The core of that is the core of the inquiry itself, namely les compétences, as you would say in French, the policy responsibilities, capacities, authority that this supranational institution possesses. That's the thing that we all focus on, so to speak. And at that level, there is no such comparable institution elsewhere. What makes it even more hazardous is that the integration of national states involved something which is absolutely, so to speak, foreign or extraneous to European integration, namely the use of violence force. There's not a single country, well, I'll take that back, maybe Australia, no country that I know of well, whose national integration has not been accompanied by violence either internal in the form of civil war or external in the form of attacks from the outside. As Chuck Tilley once said, memorably, states make war and wars make states. Well, in the case of the European Union, that little device is not permitted. So the idea, the basic idea, right from the coal and steel community in 1953, was to do this without the threat of violence, without the hegemony or overwhelming force of a single empire or imperial power. So while there certainly are elements of hegemony and have been in and out of the European Union or the politics of European integration, there's nothing like a clear imperial power, a compelling the conformity of the subordinate. Now, what this shows are the two basic dimensions of any social theory. It's ontology and it's epistemology. In the ontological sense, the vertical one, the main question is whether or not the process of integration is regarded as transformative, that is to say, by entering into it, the nature of the combined of the units, i.e. national states, and so even subnational units of those national states are transformed into something different. On the upper part, the argument is exactly the opposite. The purpose of regional integration in Europe is to rescue the nation state. It is to provide certain kinds of common goods which nation states cannot produce on their own, so they cooperate to produce them, but in doing so, they actually reinforce and protect the continued existence of national sovereignty and of national politics.
Philip,
So,
could you have a little more distance to the camera so that we can see all of it? We see just the upper parts of it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Okay,
yeah.
So the upper part are the so-called what I call reproductive theories, and essentially these are persons who come from rather orthodox, often realist international relations theory, and for them European integration is simply like a treaty or any other kind of arrangement between national states, which are intended to protect and to even extend the sovereignty of the combined of the cooperating members. And the ones down below are the transformative and ones. In the other dimension, the question is what kind of evidence is relevant to ascertaining whether the theory is relevant or not. And here we have a dramatic difference, namely whether these theories rest upon, let's say, big events, particularly constitutions and treaties, or whether they are rooted in the more or less everyday economic, social, even leisure time behavior of the actors involved in the process, and indeed even in the behavior of mass publics rather than just elites. So on the left-hand side, then you have these, and in the upper, the main debate is diagonal between the upper left-hand corner, which is intergovernmentalism. I often think of it as the Harvard theory of international, of regional integration, which just comes out of the standard IR theory, let's say, and treats the European Union as nothing really exceptional, as simply another treaty designed to reproduce the participant units. And then at the bottom right-hand side, we have this neo-functionalism with which I have been associated. On the other diagonal, you have at the bottom left, you have federalism, which of course assumes that the most important events are, quote, constitutional in nature, treaty-like, and then perhaps eventually even more than that. And I think people like Joe Weiler, et cetera, have argued that in a sense, the European Union already has, or it's a constitution, or it's a constitution in continuous development, so to speak. And in that corner, then you have the federalist perspective, which in many ways is the oldest, and the initial expectation of many people was of European federalism as a movement belongs in that corner. Finally, in the upper right-hand corner, you have a very diverse bunch of theorists who are non-transformative, but nonetheless are interested in, so to speak, everyday or ordinary, customary behavior. And here, the most important idea at the early moment, which I'll talk about in just a second, is the idea of social communication and the way in which integration changes the individual patterns of communication of those citizens and denizens inside the member states. Now, Christoph mentioned that somehow the theorists of European integration, the theories of European integration have been a kind of uniquely American product. That's not quite true. Every single one of the founding theorists of European integration was German, or German, Austrian, or Sudeten. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have dear old Stanley Hoffman at Harvard, Austrian by birth and a refugee to the United States. Then you have, on the other side, in the social communications box, you have Karl Deutsch, also, in this case, a Sudeten German. In the lower left-hand side, you have Carl Friedrich, the constitutionalist lawyer at Harvard. And then you have in the bottom right-hand corner, my mentor at Berkeley, Ernst Haas. So yes, they're all Americans, but Americans of a peculiar, shall we say, origin. And it must not be a coincidence that this happens, that they all happen to be German, or German-speaking anyway. But I can't explain that, but nonetheless, by coincidence, these are the founding fathers of European integration theory. Now, I went from the University of Geneva to do my doctorate at Berkeley. Berkeley was the only American university which would accept me. I had a somewhat diverse and rather peculiar academic background. But Berkeley accepted me. And when I arrived, I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in working on anybody's integration, least of all Europe. I was leaving Europe, and I was very much more interested in working on what I thought were much more exciting places. And I wanted to do my dissertation on Brazil and ended up doing so. But I needed the money. And Ernst Haas offered me a job for the simple reason that he heard the rumor that I could speak Spanish. And he needed somebody to go off to what was then regarded as the most successful case of regional integration, namely the Mercado Común Centroamericano, the Central American Common Market. So he sent me off to these godforsaken places like Tegucigalpa, Managua, etc., San Jose. Anyway, and San Salvador. Anyway, so I worked with him, and the basic idea was to see whether the theory he had developed out of the coal and steel community. His dissertation was on the very early aspects of European integration, and he had developed this theory of so-called Neo-Functionalism, using as the initial example the coal and steel community, and then its transformation into the European Economic Community, then the European Community, then the European Union, right? So he wanted to find out whether this had any kind of relevance in Central America, and also eventually in South America in the Asociación Latinoamericana de Libre Comercio, which I also went to. I came back and informed him that no, that these two integrations were, if not completely fraudulent, at least of all, utterly not explicable in neo-functionalist terms. So neo-functionalism was utterly worthless for understanding what was happening in Central America and in South America. But that didn't seem to bother him too much. But anyway, we wrote a few things together, and it certainly demonstrated at least the limits, which I'll come to in a moment, of neo-functionalist theory. What is neo-functionalism? At first, it belongs to a general category of social theories, which are functionalist in nature. That is, this category of theories suggests that the causes of something can be discovered by examining the impact that these decisions or these institutions have. So functionalism connects, so to speak, outcome with origin and suggests that that's a general characteristic of theories. And in this particular case, the idea is that the functions then determine what it is that actors decide to do together determines what will take place subsequently. And then that tells you also why they did it, at least initially, and then subsequently. The origins of this theory are a wonderful book, very, very imaginative book by one David Mitrani, who was a Romanian refugee at the London School of Economics in the late 30s and 40s. I think the book was written in 38, 39, something like that, and published in 43, something like twice published. Anyway, called A Working Peace System. Now, in the case of Mitrani, the idea was really absolutely crudely functionalist in the sense that it focused on the role of experts. And the basic idea was that you would target or you would empower experts to accomplish some kind of task which could not be accomplished within national borders and which required cooperation across borders. And then these experts, in resolving that task, would then pass on the capabilities, the information, the impetus to another group of experts. And eventually, so to speak, experts would take over the world and we would have a working peace system, which was certainly not democratic, but would be technocratic in today's terms. But that was Mitrani's vision. Mitrani was in London, as I mentioned, and I gather, although I don't know this for sure, that one Jean Monnet was also in London with his family cognac business at some point, and somehow I don't know whether they met personally or whether Monet read Mitrani, but whatever. When Monet began to imagine the coal and steel community, he obviously was influenced by Mitrani, and it was precisely Ernst Haas's study of the coal and steel community then that led to this further expansion of this theory. So that's functionalism then begins with this idea of a cause being explained by the effects, and that's the function, so to speak, cause and effect, or intention and effect. Then it comes the second major importance is interdependence. So you have these attempts to collectively resolve problems, but no problem is unrelated to other problems. So in solving one problem, you end up creating changes and maybe even difficulties for other problems. So the interdependence of policy arenas, we would call them today, or political functions, or whatever you want to call them, becomes a key part of this process of diffusion. So we have then this, then we have, and here we get into the third element, which is not present in Mitrani, and perhaps I think it was definitely present in Monet's thinking, because there's a very, very famous phrase in Monet's memoirs, which is, I've used it several times. It's petits pas, grands effets. So you do little things which you think are kind of easy to do, or, you know, obviously, you know, you eradicate mosquitoes or whatever the hell you try to do across national borders. But in doing so, you produce grands effets, other kinds of effects. So one of the important, now we get to the additions to Mitrani, is the notion that actors don't always know what they're doing. They enter into incomplete contracts. And once the thing starts happening, things start happening, quote, unintended consequences that were not envisioned by the original set of treaty making or whatever it is, actors. So you have interdependence combined with the idea of, let's say, unwelcome or at least worrisome effects, which tends to trigger further reactions. And it's that combination that you get this famous concept of spillover. So the core, what you're looking for, if you're a neo-functionalist, is the way in which decisions made at time one lead to something different at time two or time three. And so, and the underlying idea is that actors, particularly involved in a process like regional integration, which is so completely unprecedented and therefore not something that we experience so often that we can understand that easily what is going to happen. That's the core of the other distinction is something that is associated with, I hope he's listening, Fritz Scharpf, and that is the distinction between negative and positive integration. So very often, certainly the very label free trade association in some cases of regional integration implies simply a negative integrate. You remove barriers and you see what happens. Basta. Well, that's what happened in the coal and steel community. But immediately, the coal and steel community discovered, that's what Ernie discovered in his dissertation, was that you had to engage in some positive integration. You had to start setting rules. So you freed up the barriers to exchange and investment in coal and steel, but you then discovered that this had implications for pricing mechanisms, government subsidies, transport, all sorts of other things, right? So you had to move from a kind of relatively simplistic removal of barriers into areas of positive agreement where you had to create some kind of, quote, authority. And that's where this famous word compétence comes in. So that was what, now, then we introduce the fourth element, which is crises. That is to say, it doesn't work. You agree to do a certain number of things, and they have consequences. In the case of some cases, you agree and you don't do anything. That was what was happening with the Latin American Free Trade Association, and to a certain extent, the Central American Common Market. They had problems, but they weren't very significant, and they just ignored them and did nothing. Whereas in the case of Europe, these problems caused crises. So we have a new element in the theory, namely that at particular moments of the integration process, crises will occur because of the interdependence of the policy areas and the fact that behavior is not very predictable when you are dealing with such a unique phenomenon. So crises then drive this process forward. They force the actors to come back to their original premises and rethink what is it we should be doing. Right? And of course, as you can imagine, the mother of all crises so far and the mother of all spillovers is the Maastricht Treaty and the Agreement on Monetary Unification. I mean, if you talk about a jump into the unknown, that was obviously, so that was, if you wish, somebody wrote an article somewhere called The Revival of Neo-Functionalism, because you have to understand that in between periods where nothing particular seems to be happening, Neo-Functionalism disappears and everybody who declares it off because they assume that a stable equilibrium has been reached. We neo-functionalists don't believe there is such a thing as a stable in this particular process, and therefore just wait and something will happen and they will be forced by crisis to make a new set of decisions. And believe me, the Maastricht Treaty is about as obvious a case as you can get, but there are several other ones. So the question becomes, what do you do in the crisis? And we have this notion of spillover. So one answer to the crisis is to push integration further. And now we have the fourth or fifth, I can't remember, I've lost track, of element of neo-functionalism. Namely, this used to be called, when I was a student of international relations law in Geneva, secretariats, namely the commission. So one of the side effects of regional integration is to create a bunch of people in some place. I remember doing interviews in Montevideo to discover that there were only 5 employees of the Asociación Latinoamericana de Libre Comercio in Montevideo. I went in the building, I couldn't find them, for God's sake. So anyway, you get the picture. In Brussels, there's a lot more people. And these people have a vested interest in expanding integration. So when the crisis occurs, these people can be relied upon to come up with reasonable and expansions of their tasks. And that's exactly what takes place. So you have a new actor. You've created a new international actor, which are the secretariat / commission, which exploits the crisis. And then there's another element which we didn't think of, but this came up with, what was his name? Lindbergh and Scheingold. They pointed out a new aspect. What Leon and Stu came up with was the notion you not only had a secretariat, but that secretariat on a daily basis, literally with hundreds of people, were bringing in national civil servants and in a sense socializing them, creating a kind of internal subversive element within the national bureaucracies of these people who kept coming to Brussels to negotiate, and they got socialized, so to speak, and they were made into kind of pseudo-Europeans, or at least disposed back home to be supportive of these. So it wasn't just the nucleus of people in Brussels, but this expanded network that penetrated national bureaucracies and made it likely that. And then we get the fine. Well, maybe fine. I can't remember. I'm running out of. Anyway. The other thing that Ernie also picked up in the case of the coal and steel community, but which became epidemic after that, and that's the creation of transnational or supranational interest groups. So suddenly you had something else. You had all of these interests. In the case of coal and steel, obviously the industries involved, but also the trade unions in those particular sectors of the economy. And as it expanded further and further, you began to get more and more transnational organized interests focusing on the process. And they were also very likely. So you ended up with this triangular conspiracy, if you wish, political conspiracy behind neo-functionalism. You had the secretariat or the commission, you had the network of national civil servants that were drawn into this, and you had the interest groups. So that predisposed the European process toward spillovers in the sense of increasing both the scope of what it was doing and the authority. So a spillover has 2 dimensions. It's not only getting involved in some new area, it's also conceding or encouraging new tasks and new functions in the bureaucracy, whether it's in Brussels or Luxembourg or Frankfurt. I couldn't care less. And that's a peculiarity of it. It's distributed in different places. So now, obviously, that doesn't have to happen. So here are the limits of neo-functionalism, which is what I came up with right away in the Central American Common Market, and then down there in Montevideo in the Asociación Latinoamericana de Latino Comercio. They didn't have these interest groups. They didn't have this core. So there were the missing elements, so to speak. So that, and therefore, when they had crises, presidents met occasionally, and maybe they might reach a decision, but usually if they reached a decision, they didn't bother to implement it. So both of those, and I think this is probably true of ASEAN and all of the other ones that Tobias has come up with, that they don't have this. So when they get into crisis, either they spill back, that is to say, they just don't do anything, or even remove and go away and remove the items that they'd already had been working on simply because they were too likely to create crisis, so why bother? Let's get rid of it. Or I came up with this idea called a spill around, because in the case of Central America, you created new commitments, but you never fulfilled them. So you had lots of new things going on, but no increase in the authority of the institutions, just more and more meetings, which incidentally, I also discovered were all being paid for by the United States, not by the national company, because it was all part of something called the Alliance for Progress, which was somehow picked up regional integration as a good thing, and therefore the Americans paid for it. Now, let's begin by noting that no theory alone, no single one of those theories that I put up in those tables is able to understand the European integration process. It has too many different facets, too many different organizations, too many different dimensions, too many different policy-making processes for one theory to be able to encompass the whole thing. So, as Ernie himself said, neo-functionalism is not a theory, it's an approach. It's a way of starting to think about and to think about part of the integration process, but it's not an explanation of everything. So let's try to look at its weaknesses. The most obvious one is the linkage problem, interdependence. That's at the root. The assumption is, and certainly this was the case in Europe, that these various policy areas were indeed linked, and governments had to deal with those linkages. Whereas in other areas, they're not necessarily linked at all. They're dealt with by different ministries. Nobody pays any attention to each other. They don't interact, so to speak. So you have to assume that the process itself not only encourages the linkages, but that the linkages then have some kind of real functional effect. And that means interest associations, agencies of various kinds of national governments, even in the case of Europe, the social movements become active. A second, and this is a weakness of it, is that the entire theory was based on the assumption that you could get away with this without anybody knowing about it, or at least without mass publics knowing anything about it. That was even back to Mitrani for that matter. So the whole idea was that this conspiracy between national, supranational, and transnational interest groups, that somehow you could get away with this and that mass publics wouldn't interfere because the benefits would be so clearly good that they would just simply enjoy them and tolerate this transformation process. And here you have the whole question then is, what about such things as political parties? What about mass publics, right? Now, there was an assumption, and of course you'll get this later. You got this with Karl Deutsch, and then other versions such as, what do they call it, constructivism or something, sort of other versions of that. The idea was that you would get eventually the creation of some kind of new identity. I remember the slogan, I can't remember whether Ernie said this or I did or somebody else. Was it? The whole problem is, how do you make Europe without Europeans? And that was Monet's whole starting point. How do you do it without any Europeans? So you haven't got, at least in the case of the national integration of, let's say, some bizarre place like Switzerland, there were sort of Swiss, even though almost nobody was really Swiss until very, very recently, for that matter. But nevertheless, the whole problem was what happens when you suddenly have mass publics who either are European or un-European or national and not European. And clearly then this whole process of politicization, the organization of mass publics, the extent to which political parties find themselves compelled to deal with this thing called European integration, it was not anticipated by us, or it was anticipated, it was supposed to happen sufficiently far along so that you'd already begun to produce Europeans. And indeed, if you look at any kind of generational data of public opinion, there are Europeans. I happened to work for many years at the European University Institute. I mean, we were not only producing scholarship, we were producing Europeans. My students regularly married each other and almost never married somebody from their own country. So if you just look at the basic statistics about marriage, you will see that Europeans are being produced on a larger scale than ever before, because the probabilities of marrying somebody who's from another European, well, I won't even mention outside Europe, that gets even more complicated. But you know, there is a process going on, the kind of thing that Karl Deutsch was interested in, but it obviously has, okay. The third condition, of course, was that the entire system assumes the existence in member states of liberal democracy, that people are free to associate across borders, among other things, but also within borders. When I got to Central America, there was only one country that was a democracy of any sort, which was Costa Rica. All the others were military dictatorships. And almost the same thing was true when I got to Montevideo. So clearly, any kind of regional integration in which the actors are not legally or politically allowed to organize and express themselves, then would be irrelevant, so to speak. Okay, conclusion. Some people have argued, I kind of enjoy it because I've often described myself as the last living neo-functionalist, because the neo-functionalist has been declared dead I don't know how many times. The criticisms are pretty strong, and but I persist in believing that it is the place to start. You know, you don't finish with neo-functionalism, but it's the place to start thinking about European integration. But it's been declared dead innumerable times, and of course it's been revived, certainly Maastricht, and right now we're seeing an enormous expansion of functions. So in response to the crisis of the euro, we've seen not only in the actions of the central bank, but all sorts of other activities. Then there is the notion that somehow neo-functionalism is now, because of the present crisis, its relevance is increasing. But then we have something called post-neo-functionalism. I think I saw on the list of people who might be listening in on this, Gary Marks. I hope Gary says something in response to this, because he and his associate, his wife, are responsible for this. Post-neo-functionalism essentially suggests that we are now in a completely different political era in which functionalism doesn't work, because people are motivated by identity and various forms of, let's call them, emotional responses to political life. Europe cannot possibly at this point respond to that, and therefore functionalism no longer drives the process forward, and we're essentially in a different political world. So that's what I think I've tried to explain to you, both the range of theories and the specifics of neo-functionalism. So I thank you all for your attention. I was very impressed by the list of, but I can't see any of you, I'm afraid, other than Christophe and people at the Academy. That's a defect of this kind of system, but there were too many to be placed on the screen anyway. But I look forward to your questions. And as I say, I'm a long way away from both mentally and physically from Europe these days and thinking about Europe, but I hope I can respond to your eventual questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And we already have some questions, but I will perhaps start to get the debate a little bit lively. And let me take just a step back as a non-political scientist, and just wondering about, so why theory? So is that in a way, why theory at all? So is that something?
Yeah.
You do
because social scientists are, some of us anyway, we can't think without theory. I mean, what do you have?
Well, yeah, but
you may think, who was it? Somebody told me, you can't be atheoretical. You wouldn't know what to say. as
Well,
soon
that was
as
a
you
very
open your
general
mouth, okay, sorry.
No,
Okay.
but let me just a little bit. But so, man, in a way, modern theorists probably would say we do that to predict something. And when you want to predict something, you probably need a model that has more than one case. Then again, the European Union is quite a peculiar case. So if you have only N1, then basically you couldn't really build a theory on that has a predictive power.
But Christoph, you have an N of 1 over time. So you can treat the 1 as a sequence. So
But
the European Union becomes, right? That's one answer.
But wouldn't that be then quite ad hoc, so that you basically interpret past things, you know, and model your theory in light of that, so that in a way, you know, the theory will always be right? And
well, listen, that I agree with you. I mean, everybody tries to polish up after the fact, but no, the point is that in doing that, you're drawing upon general notions of the social scientists, and maybe even in some cases legal, because there is such a thing as legal. I mean, I think, did I hear you were at NYU? Are you a buddy of Joe Weiler? Is that
buddy
Joe?
I know.
Okay, anyway, I dearly, okay, Joe is a friend, okay? And I very much respect his work. So even there is a kind of, quote, logic, let's say, of interdependence of various kinds. So I would say that's what you're relying upon. And that is at the core. That's a core assumption that is not unique to European integration. So the notion of, I think Joe and I and Bob Cohen, I think they came up with a complex interdependence, because that makes it even more difficult, because when you have complexity on top of interdependence, the probability that you will be able to predict correctly the consequences of anything you agree on becomes lower. So each successive one, you become less and less capable of understanding your initial incomplete agreements. That's an important core notion of the social scientists. You apply that to, that's what you're doing when you're theorizing about it.
But if I may just tease you a little bit on that. So when you stress the relevance of crises for your model, then, you know, we have had a lot of crises with, I think, quite different reactions to that, because the Euro crisis created something like an intergovernmental IO, like the Stability Fund. The migration crisis basically created nothing. You know, there's basically it's not really to see so far. The pandemic probably was the one that was most crucial for any further development of supranational structures. So is there something sound in that quite different reactions to different crises for your theory? Or are you surprised by that? Or are you confirmed in your theory by that?
That's a very good point. And I maybe have not given enough thought to this, because I've tended to use crisis in a kind of generic sense. And you're right, there may be, but again, you can go back to the functionalist point of view. So some areas of policy, I'm thinking particularly of the migration issue, these are dealt with by parts of the state structure which are quite different from other parts. So in this sense, it's not surprising that the interdependence is not as experienced. And of course, the primary victims or those who negatively affected by this are people who are not capable, or usually not, unless there's some NGOs, are not capable of organizing themselves in the same way that capitalists are. So yes, so in this sense, we should introduce the factor that in a given crisis, what you want to know is the capability of those who are affected to organize themselves, and especially to organize themselves across national borders. So that would be systematically different in different kinds of crises. Right. Good. Yeah.
Very good. So questions are pouring in. So I've stayed from having my own, and instead of that, I look at the question. So obviously, Dan Kellerman had quite a similar question that I had, so I can probably leave that out. And so one question refers to Brexit as a phenomenon. So Simon Hicks is asking for that and wondering about, you know, what do you make out of that? Is that somehow fit into a new functionalist framework? Are you surprised by Brexit?
Well, this is, of course, a horrendous weakness in the entire theory. The theory never explained who should have been a part of it and who should have left. So, but for example, by every conceivable functional definition, Switzerland should have been a founding member of the EU. It says more interdependent in commercial and financial, and it wasn't. So, so one of the enormous weaknesses is that functionalism does not predict who will be involved or who will leave. Now, we just wrote an article with Zoe Leftokridis, if you're interested, on it deals with Brexit in part. And what we demonstrate is that for reasons that frankly I don't know, but I've just seen the data, I mean, we looked at the data. One of the assumptions, core assumptions, is that if you remove these restrictions to trade and investment, that, what was it? Oh, it's called Deutsches. What did he call it? I can't remember now. Something ratio, whatever. Anyway, Deutsch came up with this. Relative acceptance ratio. That was the core idea. That's Carl's. And the idea was that all things being equal, the exchanges within a regional integration should increase faster than the exchanges of the member states outside the region. You see what I'm driving at? So you remove those. So Britain should have, the proportion of imports and exports from member countries of the EU should have increased more than the imports and exports outside. And what this data shows was that from about the 1980s on, well, even the beginning of the 1970s, that reversed itself. And the Brits were in fact involved, and so that the relative acceptance ratios switched from intra-European to extra-European. So now that was, I don't say that's the cause. I'm just saying that the background to this was that for reasons which frankly I don't understand because I'm not a trade and investment expert, but something happened to these patterns of exchange in the British case, which presumably made it more plausible that the Brits could leave and still do better because they were already orienting their economy more outside of Europe than inside Europe. This is not true of any of the other member countries. So there's one, that's a neo-functionalist answer. Now, that's not the only answer, obviously. It's obvious that Brexit owes a lot to precisely those aspects of politics that neo-functionalism doesn't deal with. Questions of identity, questions of all of that messy, so-called, emotional or identity politics, which obviously played a role in this particular case, in addition to which the British have a rather peculiar party system, and therefore, the party system certainly also enters into this.
Thank you. So we have lots of quite demanding questions. Let me just really specific. So we have one questioner wondering about NAFTA, and in a way, in a double sense, NAFTA as an object of comparison. So can we learn something about NAFTA from the EU or vice versa? And secondly, as an external factor for the EU itself. So as something the EU is influencing.
What was the question about NAFTA in particular?
So the relevance of NAFTA in a double sense. So can we learn something about European integration from looking at NAFTA or vice versa? Is it a comparative
what you learn is what I learned from the Central American Common Market. Okay. Exactly the opposite. It tells you what doesn't happen and what can't happen. So NAFTA is it's not an economic failure, but it has not, quote, spilled over. And in fact, the treaty itself seems to have learned from European integration to make it very difficult to spill over. The only area where it spilled over, where something was potential, was in the area of labor relations, which they created a kind of labor relations board or something like that. Not quite like the European, not the European Court of Justice, but I mean something dealing with this. And it has occasionally been active because the idea was the American trade union movement was afraid, of course, of the Mexican competition, et cetera. And so but that didn't make, I mean, it did make some decisions, but it didn't amount to the same thing. And of course, the other thing was the American trade union movement almost completely collapsed. It almost doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the unionization in the United States is the lowest of any OECD country by an incredible margin. So that mechanism, which would potentially could have been important, was absolutely made irrelevant by the other factors in American politics, which undermined the trade union movement.
Excellent, thank you.
So now you learn from NAFTA what not to learn, or you learn from NAFTA what makes the European Union so different in its internal mechanism.
So next question is about, Karl Meyer asks about the relation between, different splits in member states. So we have a North-South, controversy. We have an East-West history in the member states. So how can you integrate that into your model? I remember you writing quite a while ago about enlargement being a big puzzle for neo-functionalism.
The theory says nothing about enlargement. Yeah. As I mentioned, if the theory were correct, Switzerland should have been a founding member, for God's sakes. And it's still not a damn, well, it is a member, but it refuses to admit it. That's another matter. But, okay. But no, so all these questions of enlargement obviously are a challenge. But I have to say, I don't think they invalidate the theory, and therefore you can look at what I think I would not have anticipated. And I'm not quite sure whether it really exists. We talk about North-South, East-West cleavages, and we think of those countries as somehow forming a bloc. And so you have somehow coalitional politics based on, well, geography, but geography being a mask for different patterns of interdependence, let's call it. That's the way we would interpret it. And I'm not sure that these blocks are actually that effective, or they're not internally divided, etc. So we use that kind of vocabulary. I just don't know enough about the substance and the positions. And as you probably know, one of the most frustrating things about the EU is the fact that lots of these processes are completely secret. So we don't know what goes on in the European Council. We don't know what goes on. And so we don't know who's on what side, so to speak, unless they speak to the press afterwards. Now, I think, what's her name? Helen. Anyways, somebody has tried to reconstruct this, but I just don't know myself. I'm not a sufficiently close observer but that is certainly not something that was anticipated. On the contrary, the anticipation was that there would be multiple lines of cleavage, and that enlargement, in fact, would improve the prospects for future spillover. That was the general feeling, let's say. And of course, I think perhaps it has when you look at it as a whole.
Yeah, I can see that. So we have more and more questions, and because they are typed, they are quite, demanding and fine-grained. So let me take one off about Karl Deutsch as a theorist. So Jonathan Seitlin is wondering, because you refer to him on the one hand as rather an intergovernmentalist, and on the other hand as someone who believed in social interaction and communication. So how do you? So that seems to be a little bit contradictory. So what
that's a good observation, but it's exactly due to the theoretical blinders that I keep putting on when I think about this process, namely the absence of what Karl was interested in was identity, and the way in which identity would change as patterns of interaction. And he meant, of course, marriage, tourism, investment, the whole business, right? So he had a very comprehensive idea of social communications. And clearly, the European Union has done that. Perhaps the most amazing one is the one that I've been involved in, which is academic. That is, nowadays, any European academic who hasn't studied in another European country or spent some time lecturing in another is so they don't exist, at least not in the social sciences that I'm familiar with. Everything is Europeanized these days. So in that sense, Deutsch, Karl would be very pleased. The problem, of course, is twofold. One is the assumption that these patterns of social communication, I won't say automatically, but tendentially produce new identities. Right. So that was, or you remember that Deutsch's doctoral dissertation was about disintegration, not integration. His doctoral dissertation was on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We'll leave aside the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire largely disintegrated because of World War I. Okay, that's a kind of unfortunate coincidence, and not a coincidence, but it sort of screws up theory because it happens and you don't anticipate that. But in any case, the basic idea was that what broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire were changes in the way in which people communicate and the language that they used to communicate with each other, right? So Karl's terms, the fact that, I mean, look at this. The Brits have just left the EU and English still remains the working language of the EU. I mean, this is a scandal. I mean, they can't do without English. So there it is, and Karl's right. I mean, but whether it produces, certainly it does in the context of the Commission and these bureaucrats and their, domestic allies. But in terms of mass publics, no. There may be barriers to entry, so to speak, with regard to identity. So you may be able to you're a Brit and you spend your vacation in Spain, but does that mean that you vote against Brexit? No, I don't know. I haven't seen any of the data, although I noticed that one of the things that's always fascinating is the age-graded nature of this. So the older you are, the less likely you are to feel European. That's period. Right, it's literally year by year. It's monotonic in nature. So whether or not Karl is right, and we'll get eventually Europe with Europeans, and that but we're a long way from that still, and we have a very strong reaction. What I couldn't, with my theory, my approach, let's call it, could not have anticipated is this reaction, and this national reaction against European integration. That. And as I say, it's very age graded, so it may just be disappearing with successive years as younger people. What we don't know too much is people who feel very European when they're 21, how do they feel when they're 51? we don't understand whether you retain identities acquired through Erasmus or whatever programs or whatever things that you do, your vacation time or whatever. When you're young, whether or not those, when you get older and you more and more radicated in a national context or whatever, whether you lose that. So we don't know too much about the overtime, the sort of half-life of this, but we definitely know that there is this age grading phenomenon, and that certainly is part of the Brexit, as with a high proportion of people over 50 who voted to leave, and the high proportion of people under 30 who voted to stay. That's a sign of something, but we don't know what those people under 30 will feel like when they're 50.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So we needed something like a life course model of European identity. And perhaps we should integrate the sociology.
I don't know much about that literature. There must be a literature which explains why certain things acquired at certain ages tend to survive and other ones get displaced. I don't know that literature, so I have no way of.
Now, that leads to some other questions. I think we have at least three of them. Alan Hinsey, Karen Alter, and Helen Hartnell, all somehow interested in what you already started to address, the backlash, the disintegration, the things that are now somehow disintegrating European integration on many levels, and how your model and how your theory, or it's not a theory as you said, how your take is on that. So would you have, I remember I said this in my introduction in 2002, you already wrote about disintegration. Any comprehensive theory of integration has to include disintegration. But did you, so which element of this tendency somehow surprises you more than others, or did you expect anything of that to happen, or is there factors that surprise you, others that not? So that
it's no mystery why I was more concerned or than most with disintegration, because that's what I studied at first. That's exactly.
Yeah.
Remember, I was studying a common market where two countries, member countries, went to war with each other, for God's sakes. El Salvador and Honduras went to war. You're members of the same common market and you go to war with each other. That's kind of embarrassing, to put it mildly. So yes, and now it happens, at least again from this neo-functional perspective, that there are certain conditions: democracy, freedom of association across borders, the existence of a strong secretariat from the beginning. It's all those things we talked about that make it very unlikely that you will get a spill back in response to crisis, right? But I don't think, because unfortunately, the theories of regional integration were sort of developed around European integration. It was only those of us who began looking around the world, in my case, Central and South America, that began to be, realized that it didn't have the same kind of intrinsic dynamic that we thought, or we still think, I do anyway, is characteristic of European integration.
Okay. I was wondering about, if I may introduce one question. So one of the elements that I think from early on was part of the model is that the European integration is not built on any form of violence, different from state building. But is that really true? In that you might say, we have examples for state building, which there is a direct war in advance, but we have others in which there's an incremental process, and we couldn't even find some kind of original violent process. And then we have the European integration, which was so much defined by the experience of World War II in the mid-50s, so that in a way, to make this a categorical distinction, there's the normality of violent state building and the exception of non-violent European integration seems to be a little bit, at least, overdetermined.
Well, of course, what you haven't said the magic word, but it's something which I suppose we should have said a long time ago, namely the existence of NATO beforehand. So the European Union didn't have to deal with that crap because we had this thing which was clearly a hegemonic American enterprise, but it was already in existence, and therefore, and of course, as even today, they're not totally coterminous with each other, but nonetheless, the fact that these countries, certainly the original six and others have joined, that there was this other thing over here, which was not regional, it was North Atlantic, shall we say, rather than European. But that certainly meant that those kind of issues were, so to speak. And the other thing, of course, is that to become a member, you have to resolve the problems with your neighbors. It's one of those conditions. So you cannot have sort of outstanding territorial or populational, or whatever it is, demographic disputes with neighbors. So many countries, that's one of the reasons that's holding up, of course, the membership of the ex-republics of Yugoslavia. So here we have, Greece was admitted, but problematically over obviously the Cyprus issue is a kind of embarrassment because that doesn't, so there are fringe problems like that, but they certainly limit enlargement, but they have not affected, it seems to me, the process. And the best thing that could happen for Europe is to go to war with Russia. I mean, if we listen to Chuck Tilley, right? So what we need is a nice quiet war, maybe over Ukraine, and the Russians decide to invade Ukraine, and EU then, which has been, increasingly taking military integration seriously, even beyond the NATO level of integration. So I hope that isn't going to happen, but that's the best thing, presumably, that could happen to Europe. We'd get a European identity very quickly if the Russians invade Ukraine and the Europeans respond in some collective way, even beyond what Americans would, or what NATO would do. But thank goodness. I
think it's
the
quite
latest news seems to be that that's not going to happen. So,
yeah.
okay.
So we have two interesting questions left. Ulrike Liebert is interested in the question what does neo-functionalism can contribute to the question of the democratization of supranational institutions. So we have obviously democratic member states, not all of them, that will be the last question, but still some. And we have the Commission, the Parliament, and so on. And are they in need of democratization? Are they already democratized, or what's your take on that?
I'm embarrassed. I mean, I've written a book on how to democratize the European Union, but it's not neo-functionalist in nature. In other words, neo-functionalism, frankly, begins with and it was there already in Mitrani and the earlier versions. I mean, it's anti-democratic. And in the case of Mitrani, it's the case for a technocratic form of government that has absolutely nothing to do with representation, yes, but representation through interests, etc. But no elections, no, that messes things up. And certainly, if you read Monet's memoirs, you will see he's not very happy. I mean, Monet was not exactly a practicing Democrat, right? I mean, he was the ultimate French technocrat from, even though I don't think he went to ENA. I think he was in the family cognac business. But anyway, it's that mentality which is behind that kind of thinking. So there is no intrinsically, the only thing that is intrinsically democratic about it, perhaps, is this reliance on interest politics and the fact that you need competitive interest groups, etc., and their ability to form across national borders, etc. So that aspect of democratic politics is certainly a very key element of neo-functionalism. But to the extent that for most people, democracy has something to do with political parties, competitive elections, citizens voting as individuals, etc., they're not there. They weren't there at the beginning, and it's something which happens. And presumably, the idea is that in this, let's say, new world, people will become increasingly indifferent. The democracy will be a kind of public entertainment, a form of public entertainment, which will not interfere with the functional aspects of government. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit, but there's certainly nothing intrinsically democratic other than as I say, the interest group competition, blah, blah, blah aspects. But democratic understood in this party elections notion, there's not. On the contrary, they are an impediment, or potentially an impediment. And the assumption was that impediment could be, so to speak, withheld or put off long enough for this process to assert itself and for its benefits to be felt. And then presumably after that, democracy, at least integration as a subject of democratic dispute, would have disappeared. I think that's fair to say.
Now, when we look at the member states, and we come to an end, Dan Kellerman again asks, when the basic assumption of neo-functionalism is that all member states have to be democracies to produce certain effects, what do we do with the fact that now not all member states at the moment are functional democracies, but have become semi or full-fledged autocracies?
Well, that's an embarrassment. It's not something that was anticipated. And what's worse is that this illiberal democracy is not merely a matter of rigged elections or, let's say, government skewing of elections, if not outright fraud. But also it has affected social movements and interest associations, which, as I say, are more, so to the extent that non-democracy in these member countries, member states, or illiberal democracy in member states gets to that level, then yes, I mean, we assumed that democracy was a precondition, and that as a precondition, it would reproduce itself. That was not, has proven not to be the case. It has proven to be the case for many of the countries, but certainly for, say, Hungary, Poland, and some of the Eastern countries especially, but to try to imagine Serbia as a member or something like that, very difficult. I mean, they crossed the threshold to get in, barely, right? But they didn't. So that's, yes, that takes something else, a different approach or a different theory. The assumption of neo-functionalism was that those basic liberal democratic freedoms of association especially were characteristic and would remain so among member countries.
But as you have this wonderfully open and somehow relaxed approach to your own theory, I was just wondering, if you leave aside your theory, what would you take? What would you make out of this development at the moment? So do you see, is there any...
I've written about that elsewhere. No, what? I've written about that elsewhere. That has nothing to do with neo-functionalism.
Yeah, okay.
That's another topic I'll be glad to talk about someday, but that would take a very long time. But I can refer you to, I've written, yes.
But as of 2021, you would say there's a positive role for the supranational organs to somehow foster democracy in the member states. Do you see the commission or the court to somehow do something about that? Or is that somehow, has to be left? Do they have to be left to themselves? Well, that would be interesting to know.
I hope that Klaus Offer is listening to this, because Klaus and I at one point were interested in this question of democracy promotion, and the EU probably has spent more money on democracy promotion than even the United States, for that matter. We expressed considerable skepticism about the entire idea, as a matter of fact, and although it is true that according to the data that we gathered, democracy promotion by the EU was more successful than democracy promotion by the United States. We had developed an indicator of democratization, but that indicator, incidentally, is out of date. So it shows considerable success stories in Poland and Hungary, which of course is no longer the case. So that's another matter. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm reminded, this is my Brazilian days. A lei não pegou is the wonderful Brazilian expression. The law didn't stick. In this case, the regime didn't stick, right? So they tried, but it didn't stick. It came loose. That, I think, is something. Anyway. Yes, a lei não pegou.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are now perfectly in time for this really most interesting contribution and for the many, many aspects you gave to us. And I think we had many questions and all have been answered. That's rare, actually. So
I'm sorry we can't answer them all. Maybe you can send them to me or something.
Well,
and
I think we're
individually,
it
would be nice for me. I would love to just see what, especially the ones that came in after I talked. I don't know how you could ask questions before I said anything, but anyway, I guess some of them have read my materials.
So with this,
Christoph, thank you.
Well, thank you, Philip, and I
thank the Academy for the occasion. I feel very honored by it, and I hope that we'll see each other in Berlin. I'm trying to get back to my home in Italy, but it's been unsuccessful. But I'm still trying, and once I get back to Italy, maybe I will get to Berlin to see all of you. So
the minute this will be possible, we will bring you over, and thank you for making the European Union as entertaining as it never had been before. And thank you.
Well, that's one thing I always warn my students who want to work on the EU, is it's boring beyond belief when you start looking at the details. So it is a boring subject.
This is why you had to be added to the subject. So thank you so much. Come over when you can. And everyone is warmly invited to join us for our next event on May 4th. Our artist in residence, Tony Coates, will talk about his most work. So bye-bye, everyone, and thank you so much.
Bye, and thank all of you.